Welcome. My name is Peter Klein. I'm a professor at the UBC School of Journalism and director of the UBC Global Reporting Center, and it's my honor to welcome you to our War Stories tonight. We want to begin by acknowledging we're on the traditional, ancestral, unceded land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. These nations, like so many nations throughout history, have had long histories of warfare. The locations of the original settlements throughout the Vancouver metro area were chosen largely for strategic purposes, to watch for enemy attacks. Our collective oral histories and our religious texts are filled with war stories. These stories often define our histories and sometimes define our identities. If any of you grew up amongst veterans or victims of war like I did, your childhood memories may likely be filled with war stories. My uncle spent 6.5 years in a prisoner of war camp, and barely a dinner went by without stories about his experiences on the front lines or in his prison camp. But our collective war stories, whether from relatives or from history texts or from the various Bibles or Qurans throughout our own traditions, are often sanitized and simplified. War is messy and complex, and tonight we are embracing that messiness and that complexity. We have speakers who'll share stories of the major characters of war, the civilians and soldiers who bear most of the cost of war. Farah Nosh spent most of her career documenting the toll of war on people throughout the Middle East. Ann Jones has borne witness to wars on 3 continents, and she's found stories that no one else was telling. Derek Gregory spent much of his career studying the political and geographic nuances of war. And we have the stories of the soldiers themselves, the cost that soldiers themselves have paid, told by the soldiers. After the performances and the speeches, we're going to have a Q&A, which will allow you to ask some questions of our presenters. I want to note that this evening is being recorded for potential broadcast on CBC Ideas, so please note that whatever you say may be ultimately broadcast. I want to thank the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies for organizing and sponsoring this event, as well as the Global Reporting Center, the Movember Foundation, the Tyee, and the Georgia Strait. And welcome to our War Stories.
Thank you for coming out. Peter, thank you for thinking of me and including me tonight, the Global Reporting Center, and the Peter Wall Institute, of course, for making this conversation happen. My family's in the front row, so it's hard not to look at them and acknowledge them, and a few of you that are here that have supported my work. Okay, wonderful, we're up. Thank you. I can't say I would have accomplished any of this without this. I'm sure, well, I know reluctant support to allow your daughter to go off to war. And my sisters, of course, had to deal with that as well. So I've never publicly acknowledged their support to allow me the space to do that. Love you guys. So, and this crew over here, we all engage with war on a different level, but my excitement to be here with you guys tonight and sitting with you and among you is that war guides our passions, and somehow that's really comforting. I know there's several of you out here who probably have your own war story of some sort. Maybe you've left your ancestral homeland and you've come here and you're watching the tragedies of war from a distance. I'm sure that's the story. Or you've lived through war in your faraway countries and you've fled as refugees or as immigrants. Or you're highly politicized and you follow the wars every day, which in itself is exhausting. I know we all know people, and maybe it's among us, who say, I can't do it, I can't follow it anymore, it's too much, right? We've all had moments of that, I have, where it can just be exhausting to continue to know what's happening. And yet, I just want to remind you that knowing what's happening out there, because it's always over there, it's never here, right? Knowing what's happening is absolutely nothing compared to living it. And I think that's part of what we're trying to bring you tonight is living war, to have war come to your door. Just today, a quick flash of a news of a family in East Jerusalem who had lived there since the 1930s and were forced out of their homes today. And I just been thinking about it all day. You know, just paying attention for a second can disturb your day all day, right? But I just remind myself that I am given the freedom and the choice to enter and to leave, which is a privilege, and that's definitely not the case for many people on the planet today. And, you know, the small burden of knowing what's happening versus living it, having your home torn down, having the occupying force storm through your neighborhood and occupy your lands for all time, which of course happened here not that long ago. And may that always be the case for us here now, that we never know what it's like to have to flee, to grab your kids and run, or to hold your dead child. And that's something that happens around the world in conflict zones daily, especially if you're following the crisis in Syria right now. The child deaths are absolutely disturbing. Or in a flash, you lose everything, which was the case with Rena here. I had scoured Baghdad for weeks looking for a woman to tell me her story, her brutally wounded story. And by the time I found Rena, Baghdad had declined into a degree of sectarian violence that I don't think we have a complete picture of, because it was so dangerous at the time to be in Baghdad that often Western journalists were operating either from inside the green zone without ever really leaving. And I think there's a wave, like almost a blackout of the history of this recent war in Iraq that we don't even know because of the great degree of violence, the sectarian divisions that was happening on a geographical perspective, even to consider how the sectarian violence shifted the geography of one city of Baghdad. So if you can imagine these networks of sectarian groups shifting and moving, and neighborhoods became divided by either Shia or Sunni, and these sectarian enclaves were divided with blast walls, with security forces. So if you were one, you wouldn't necessarily go into a neighborhood of the other. And this was a huge landscape of fear that was created within Baghdad, that completely divided the city. And of course, I had to deal with that when I found Rena, because my driver was Sunni and I was asking him to enter a Shia neighborhood. And I spent some time, my parents probably won't like hearing this story actually, now that I just looked at them. Spent some time convincing my driver, Mohammed, to take me to this neighborhood, this Shia neighborhood, to see and meet this woman, Rena, that I had heard about, to see if she would agree to tell me her story and have her photograph taken, of course. And when I found her, there was a rule that we weren't allowed to stay more than half an hour and that we were never to return. And of course, once Rena and I started talking, there was a great deal of healing on some level that came to her from just simply telling her story. And I think that's a huge part of the work that journalists are doing, At first I thought, what's the point of doing it if it never gets published, if nobody sees it? But I learned later that part of it was having her tell the story. No one had asked her what had happened. I was the first person that she told her story to, and she wept and wept and wept and wept. She was 8 months pregnant, walking with her youngest sister when a U.S. aerial strike had happened in Sadr City as part of the U.S. campaign to clean up the sort of non-compliant nature of Muqtada al-Sadr at the time. And the aerial strike tore off her leg and killed her sister and her unborn 8-month-old infant. I'm going to move into a slideshow in a little bit, but there are so many stories like this. It's so hard to pull out and extract a few individual stories. I would be here all night. But the thing about Rana, the thing about everybody that I really encountered was a little bit, it's amazing how far a little bit of empathy goes in terms of allowing them just to see that somebody cared to hear their story and to tell their story. And, I really went in there without anything to offer them. Of course, they saw hope in me because I was asking, and I know it went through their minds. Maybe I could get them to America. Maybe I could get them a prosthetic. Maybe I would save them in some way. And in some situations I was able to offer help, and others I wasn't. But often it's just having them tell their story. Suhad, I'm actually indirectly related to, but if you could possibly imagine for a moment being at home and baking a cake for your twin sons on their birthday and then having them not come home. Also killed in the sectarian violence, they just disappeared, and the family would scour the morgues for days and days until they finally found their bullet-riddled bodies and sort of unidentifiable in a morgue. So the work that I am going to share with you is a body of work from covering the region, just the early days of the Iraq War, daily life under curfew, the Iraqi refugee crisis in Syria, and the July War in Lebanon in 2006.
حيدر سمير أحمد، مولد 1/8. الحادث ورا السقوط.
اسمي ضياء سخي حان، مواليد 64 وانضربت 25/5/2003 ومصادفة زوجتي جابت.
أنا اسمي سيف يوسف حنان. أنا كنت مريض، يعني سخنت صارت يعني شلون صارت أنا وابن عمي بالسيارة عندنا جسر مسافة الجسر.
محمد علي عبد الهادي. وبعد الغداء هنا ببيتنا هذا كان بيت بنتي موجود بالشارع المجاور. مرينا وياي 5 أشخاص بسيارة مال قرايبي مرسيدس.
نصير عبد الرحمن، مواليد 1960.
على مود نمر بالبيت.
تاريخ بالضبط 24/12/2004. 24/12/2004 كانت حكومة هياد علاوي. يعني تقريبا حكومة هياد علاوي برأيي أنا كانت زينة، يعني أحسن من هاي الحكومات. المهم رجعت البيت.
اسم رزاق راشد عباس.
الظاهر كان
مواليد 1952. الحالة الزوجية متزوج. في الشرطة عندي 32 سنة. كنت هنا كانت بداية رمضان سنة 2003. 27/10/2010
اسمي فلاح حسن،
كان بداية
مواليد 74 1974.
We've seen civilians in these moving pictures, and we will soon witness a play written and presented by soldiers. We think of the civilian and the soldier as two separate and very different faces of war, but I've worked with both of them in Afghanistan and other war zones, and I have come to see them as intimately related, intimately connected, fellow sufferers of more encompassing enemies, the violence of neocolonialism and capitalism, the violence of war itself. So I want to speak this evening about a psychological affliction that haunts them both, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. American soldiers are routinely diagnosed and treated intensively for PTSD. Civilians in the same war zone suffer the same symptoms, but having no safety, no money, no health care, no government, they get no diagnosis, no treatment. What is post-traumatic stress disorder? We throw the term around way too loosely, but it has specific psychiatric diagnostic criteria, first defined in 1980 in the 3rd edition of the American Psychiatric Bible, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-3. For diagnosis of PTSD, the patient must have suffered a sudden catastrophic event threatening imminent death that caused him to feel intense fear, helplessness, and horror. Fear, helplessness, and horror. Initially, that catastrophic event had to be outside the range of usual human experience. That phrase was dropped in DSM-4, published in 1994, because psychiatrists finally realized that war itself is outside the range of usual human experience, and conversely, that catastrophic events are perfectly usual in war. Further, according to the diagnostic manual, PTSD is marked by distinctive clusters of symptoms that persist long after the traumatic event. For diagnosis, the patient must suffer from at least one such cluster. Many suffer from all of them, just as civilians do. First, intrusive recollections of the traumatic event, such as flashbacks or nightmares. Second, constriction of emotion and avoidance of any situation reminiscent of the trauma. This appears as emotional numbing, detachment, and estrangement from other people and activities, shutting down. Third, hyperarousal, emerging in exaggerated startling, hypervigilance, irritability, outbursts of anger, and the inability to concentrate or to fall asleep. Many of these symptomatic behaviors in soldiers can be explained as adaptations to life in a war zone where people are trying to kill you. And they may gradually disappear over time at home if they are not complicated by additional problems like alcohol and drug abuse. Civilians suffer the same symptoms. I tested off the diagnostic charts myself simply by living too long in war zones. For veterans, this is what makes reintegration at home so difficult. For civilians in a war-ravaged country where the whole population is likely to be traumatized, this is what makes rebuilding a peaceable country a project that consumes generations. PTSD has a history. It was added to DSM-3 specifically to cover retroactively the troubled veterans of America's war against Vietnam. A couple of prominent psychiatrists who had led rap groups in New York City for members of Vietnam vets against the war in the 1970s pushed for it. They said that what vets suffered was different from ordinary depression or anger management problems. Robert J. Lifton, in particular, wrote about the unresolved death guilt of the anti-war vets and the sparks that ignited their rage. He wrote of their habit of violence, the tendency to use violence as an absolute solution to the slightest threat, and of their profound sense of betrayal, the sense of having been victimized, badly used, or as they often put it, fucked over, and put in a situation in which they both slaughtered people and suffered for no reason. They directed their rage toward political leaders, the Veterans Administration, any figures of authority. But Lifton reports there was a special kind of rage reserved for the military. Notice that PTSD is unlike any other psychiatric illness described in DSM-3 or any of the subsequent diagnostic manuals. It does not arise from the patient's own psyche. Instead, it comes out of the blue, all of a sudden, and smashes him or her from the outside. The same kind of thing happens all the time in war zones to civilians. Lifton and others took this as evidence that no matter what a victim's personal psychological history might be, he or she could be totally remodeled by war. And that is precisely what people have said from ancient times to the present about so many returned veterans. They are changed. But at the same time in the 1980s, psychoanalytic psychiatry as practiced at Veterans Administration's hospitals in the United States insisted on sticking to the Freudian talking cure. It assumed that a patient's outward symptoms of PTSD were manifestations not of his moral outrage or his politics, but of the unspeakable catastrophic trauma he was trying to exclude from consciousness, and that only by dragging that trauma into consciousness or some childhood trauma behind it could that patient be healed. Since the aim of VA counseling was to get the patient to speak about the traumatic event, the counselor was instructed to remain steadfastly non-judgmental. So I ask you, what kind of treatment can a non-judgmental Freudian therapist give to an angry vet who has already reached all kinds of judgments about the morality of the war and the politics of the national leaders who sent him to fight it? Well, we might have to call that medical treatment. And indeed, in the US, the medicalization of the war against Vietnam silenced the narrative of those sick veterans and established the outrageous atrocity that was that war against Vietnam as normal procedure for the American military. Another matter of history, also at the same time, about 1980, feminist researchers pointed out that they had already described an affliction that looked just like PTSD, and that they had called rape trauma syndrome. Feminists had also found the same symptoms in both battered women and incest victims who commonly are raped over and over again. In a classic book, Trauma and Recovery, psychiatrist Judith Herman proposed another diagnosis for the DSM. She called it complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The term applied, Herman argued, to the more profound suffering of those who endure not a single catastrophic event, but repeated traumatic events over an extended period of time. Some people, she said, are trapped in situations where they are made to face that terrible sense of powerlessness and fear and the paralyzing fear of imminent death over and over again. Such a relentless assault upon the self should be recognized as a different category of damage. In proposing this, Herman was not thinking of combat soldiers, but of battered women under threat of death, repeatedly subjected to rape and battery. But she had hit upon the very thing that battered women and soldiers have in common, the very thing that soldiers and civilians in war zones have in common. Psychiatrists have known since World War I that the disorder then called shell shock was a form of hysteria, a collection of symptoms often presented by women victims of sexual violence. In the best of all possible worlds, feminists and veterans might make common cause and work to end war. But no, the Pentagon is not happy with the suggestion that glorious war trauma resembles anything like a girly affliction. Instead, they campaign to rename PTSD as PTSI, not a post-traumatic stress disorder, but an injury. And many in the military argue that PTSI should be rewarded with a Purple Heart, the American decoration usually given to soldiers who suffer physical wounds in combat. Needless to say, nobody has ever suggested that raped and battered women should get medals for the combat trauma they've gone through, nor should the civilians in our foreign wars. But missing from this controversy and from the treatment of PTSD itself is any consideration of the unresolved death guilt or the immense sense of betrayal that Robert Lifton reported, and that many veterans of America's recent wars feel every bit as strongly as did the vets of Vietnam. The standard diagnosis, whether of disorder or injury, leaves no room for soldiers to speak of guilt or rage, of slaughter or suffering. Yet many suffer enormous guilt, knowing that America's wars and the things they did or witnessed there were based on lies and the ambitions of war profiteering corporate America. Nevertheless, the medicalization of war trauma remains standard procedure today, though the time-consuming talking cure has given way, under pressure from big pharma, to quick prescriptions for opioid narcotics. The Pentagon now finds PTSD to be relatively common and luckily quite useful in raising citizen sympathy for soldiers, defusing opposition to Washington's wars, and transforming into mental health problems the rage and despair of veterans that might raise once again those inconvenient political and moral issues. Today, some psychiatrists speak of the moral injury of soldiers. But so far has America come from the days when moral principles had something to do with the conduct of our wars and our soldiers, that even when returning veterans take their own lives and or murder their wives or children or fellow soldiers or total strangers here at home, as uncounted hundreds of American soldiers have done, advocates will speak up to blame not the homicidal soldiers, nor the officers who misled them, nor the presidents who hurled them into needless wars of choice, nor Congress, nor the citizens who looked the other way, and certainly not war itself. No, not at all. Today, we pin it all on PTSD, a sickness of the mind which happily can be treated with a pill. And as for those traumatized civilians of countries where we wage war, well, they'll just have to get over it.
Good evening, my name's Derek Gregory. I'm from the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Most Canadians will surely know John McCrae's poem, In Flanders Fields, recited every Remembrance Day, in honour of those who fell during our nation's wars. But what we forget is that John McCrae was a medical officer who served with the Canadian Field Artillery. And he wrote that poem on the 3rd of May 1915, sitting on the back of an ambulance at Essex Farm Advanced Dressing Station, where hundreds and thousands of wounded were treated for their wounds. In other words, what lies behind that extraordinary, vivid, moving poem? What lies beyond the sea of poppies waving in the wind is a crowded, complicated landscape of those who somehow survived the war. And those who survived that war are almost always erased from our memories and our books. John Keegan says that the wounded soldier, as soon as he falls, disappears from the story. And yet, as H.G. Hartnett wrote, remembering his own experience on the Western Front in the First World War, ahead of us and behind us, as far as the eye could see, a long column of walking wounded slowly made their way through the valley and across the ridges. From a distance, the khaki column resembled a huge brown snake crawling across the country. And what I've been doing over the last several years is trying to track that snake through war after war after war. Now, when we think of the First World War, we typically think of that churned charnel house no man's land, that ravaged strip between the two front lines. And what we forget is lying behind those front lines, behind the network of trenches, were fields, farms, villages, and towns, many of them inhabited as the fighting raged. And so, not surprisingly, there were civilian casualties, hit by shells, killed by bombs, injured by clouds of billowing gas. And those civilians were not the only civilians on the battlefield, because a whole host of humanitarian organizations took the field to provide medical support, including the Friends Ambulance Unit, the Red Cross, and the St. John's Ambulance Brigade. So it was a crowded, complicated landscape. There's a sense in which modern war has always been war amongst the people. But in the First World War, we know that the vast majority of casualties were indeed soldiers, like those treated by John McCrae at Essex Farm. And we surely know that many of them, usually long after the event, set down what they remembered. And we can all look to the soldier poets, to novelists, people like Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, who conjure up a whole landscape of suffering. But there's often a very real difference between the immediacy and intimacy of the notes and jottings and letters that even they wrote at the time, and the polished prose which emerged several years later. And that difference resides in the obvious fact that trauma fractures narrative. Stories lose their coherence in the buzzing, blooming, teeming horror of war itself. And the horror on the Western Front was redoubled because there, essentially 19th century medicine collided with 20th century industrialized conflict. So military medicine had to radically reinvent itself, and fast. And it did so by constructing a medical military machine, one which had to cope with injuries to the body which were unprecedented. Emily Mayhew tells us that the Flanders casualty was almost torn apart, gone with the neat round holes made by rounded ammunition that flew slowly in the hot, dry African sun. She's thinking of the Boer War. Now she talks about the cylindro-conical bullet fired by the new powerful weaponry that hit fast and hard, went deep and took bits of dirty uniform and airborne soil particles with it. And as a result, one of the problems that compounded the extraordinary severity of the wound, that damage to that fleshy, baggy sac of the human body, was the spread of infection. And so for that reason, a premium was placed on moving medical care as close to the point of injury as possible and moving wounded soldiers rapidly through an evacuation chain. The first task was to find the wounded. Now, in a sense, of course, that was simple. During a major offensive, there were hundreds of them, thousands of them, all over no man's land. But nobody knew for sure where they were. And when darkness fell, when they crawled into shell holes, cowering, in the water, in the slime, in the ooze. They cried for help, and they hoped that the regimental stretcher bearers would hear them, would crawl out under cover of darkness and retrieve their battered and broken bodies. They would then make a slow and painful journey down the trenches. This was compounded again and again and again by the broken, fractured terrain, ruined by the weapons of industrialized warfare. The rain has made the ground a sea of mud, wrote one stretcher bearer, and we have to carry the wounded 3 miles to the dressing stations. 2 men using stretcher slings couldn't carry a man 30 yards, and I've seen 4 bearers up to their knees in mud, unable to move without further assistance. Ultimately, they were taken to an advanced dressing station, where a medical officer would do his best to stop the bleeding and to splint up any obvious injuries. From there, the men would be loaded onto ambulances. But things didn't necessarily speed up once they were in the back of one of those trucks. George Carter wrote in 1916 of struggling with his load. Ammunition first, way for ammunition, is all he heard. The ambulances couldn't get through, he writes, even when they were not stuck in the mud and men were dying by the roadside, because that is the army rule. Ammunition before everything, wounded second. It was much more important to get the supplies, the bullets, the shells, and fresh meat up to the trenches than it was to evacuate the battered remains of war. But those ambulances would eventually rattle their way towards a casualty clearing station. And it was here, as close to the front line as they could safely be, that many of those men received their first full medical and surgical attention. It was here, too, that they first encountered female nurses. And from there, they would be taken several days later by ambulance train to a hospital on the French coast. The Private Lord Crawford tells an extraordinary story of taking his men, a party of stretcher bearers, down to the station to wait for the ambulance train. It was, as usual, late because these trains are always held up. They were a low priority because they were leaving the front. It was much more important to make space and time for all of those trains bringing fresh recruits and supplies up to the front. And he describes a train pulling through the station, full of fresh-faced young boys, kids really, hanging out of the windows, shouting, screaming, full of excitement, singing songs. The train goes through the station, there's a hiss of brakes, a hiss of steam. The train slowly backs into the station. And Crawford says, one by one, all of those carriages fell silent as those boys looked across the platform and they saw the occupants of those stretchers, covered with mud and blood, still wearing their boots. Suddenly, he says, this whole trainload of new soldiers was startled into silence. For the first time, these men were in the presence of the real thing. But even when they were on the train, things didn't speed up. The nearer you get to the front, wrote one of the nurses on those trains, the longer it takes, as trains are always having to shunt and go around loops to make room for supply trains. Ultimately, they would arrive at a base hospital. But they might have to go from one base hospital to another because the first one was too full. Only the most seriously injured, those who were not expected to make the journey to the next available hospital, were offloaded. And even at those hospitals, it could take several hours to unload a full ambulance train, which meant that that journey from being wounded to a hospital on the coast could occupy days and even weeks. But there was something mechanical about the whole process. Here's Private Alfred Arnold describing how one train came into one of those base hospitals and he saw it being emptied of our wounded at the front and being filled at the back with yet more wounded who were going to be taken down to the docks and sent by hospital ship to Britain and Canada and beyond. Now that's an extraordinary chain involving all sorts of people and materials. And Arthur Empey says that when you realise that all the ambulances, trains and ships, not to mention the manpower used in transporting a wounded man, could be used for supplies, ammunition and reinforcements, it will not appear strange that from a strictly military standpoint, a dead man is sometimes better than a live one if he's wounded. And for those that were wounded, what lay ahead? I ask you to think of the care or the non-care that was provided for those wounded in these wars. Here's Kate Luard trying to cheer up a young soldier who's lost his arm, amputated at one of those casualty clearing stations. I told him what splendid new arms soldiers would get now, and everyone would give them the best possible jobs, like messengers and commissionaires, before civilians, and his brow cleared at the rosy vision. I only hope it's true, she wrote to her family. Is it? This is perhaps the moment to fast forward 100 years and think about what has changed and what hasn't. Now, the route from the point of injury to the point of what's called definitive care is measured in hours and at most 2 or 3 days. But here we're dealing with a radically complicated world. When we think about Afghanistan, we're not dealing with a linear battle space, a world of fronts and supply lines. We're dealing with a profoundly non-linear battle space. But it's a battle space which has been transformed by a new medical geography. We now know, for example, that those hours and days that it took the wounded to reach serious medical care are precious days wasted. So much depends on what can be done by a combat medical technician and by a soldier's buddies in the platinum 10 minutes of life-saving care. But then we've refined the concept of the golden hour. It becomes crucial to get the wounded to definitive care within 60 minutes. If we can do that, their chances of survival soar. It's much harder, though, to recover the experience of those caught up in these evacuation chains, because unlike the First World War, where soldiers are writing notes, jottings in their diary, even letters to their family, many of them, for much of this period, today's soldiers are sedated. And so we have to find new ways of recovering their stories. And it's important to do that, not just so that we understand the continuing new horror of war, but for soldiers themselves, it's important as part of their process of recovery and rehabilitation to understand what has happened to them during that precarious journey. And I want to share with you 2 innovative attempts to do just that. The first is from a book by Brian Kastner, himself a veteran, called All the Ways We Kill and Die. And in that book, he tells the story of a friend of his, US Air Force Technical Sergeant Daniel Fye, who stepped on an IED during clearance operations in Panjwai in May 2011. This is an imaginative reconstruction drawn from his conversations with his friend. They worked on Fye a long time. The longer they worked, the more anxious he got about the precious minutes slipping away. I don't hear the bird, he said, over and over. And eventually he heard the thumping of the rotors. Fye thought it was the most wonderful sound he'd ever heard. They were at the extreme limit of the NATO footprint. So it was a 60-kilometre flight to the main hospital in Kandahar. If they moved quickly, Fye would just make it in the magic golden hour. Now, in a sense, he was fortunate to be wounded when he was, because in 2007, the International Security Assistance Force produced an extraordinary map of its medical evacuation coverage using helicopters, calibrated on a 2-hour interval between the point of injury and surgery. That way they could cover most of Afghanistan. But when it came to the golden hour, as soon as that was factored in, the coverage shrank. And that takes into no account the sheer difficulty of flying helicopters in the high, fractious, hot air over Afghanistan. It also doesn't take into account the problems of miscommunication. When Fay got on board that helicopter, he was surprised to find that nobody on board paid any attention to him. But the reason was that there were no medics on board. This wasn't a medical evacuation. His platoon had repeatedly called for help on the basis of Fay suffering bilateral amputations, but that got scrambled over the radio to bilateral lacerations. It wasn't a medical emergency. Nobody bothered. So it was his good fortune that that helicopter dropped out of the skies and saved his life. So medical evacuation times are crucial, and they've speeded up dramatically, so that over the last 5 years or so, most of those flights are now, for all sorts of reasons, within the so-called golden hour, which means that wounded soldiers can receive definitive care very rapidly at level 3 trauma centres, at Bagram, at Camp Bastion, at Kandahar and elsewhere. And from there, they can be placed on board medical transport planes, and following the American line of evacuation, they can go via Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, the largest American medical facility outside the United States, and from there on to Walter Reed National Medical Center in the United States. Now, that's a remarkably elongated evacuation chain compared to anything you would have found in the First World War, but at the same time, it's remarkably compressed. Everything is speeded up. But another way of telling the experience of those who go down that evacuation chain is to be found in an extraordinary novel written by Harry Parker, which tells the story of Captain Tom Barnes, a British Army officer who steps on an IED while on patrol in Afghanistan. The IED blows one leg off, he's evacuated, and the other leg is surgically removed. Now, this is an extraordinary novel because Harry Parker stepped on an IED in Helmand province in July 2009. He lost one leg in the blast, was evacuated, and had the other leg surgically removed. And he confronts exactly the problem that I raised a few moments ago. Not only does trauma rupture language, but memory is fleeting. Consciousness ebbs and flows. I never knew quite the full story, he says, because obviously I was eyes shut, gritting teeth. I was conscious, I thought, for all of it, but then 10 days later someone told me we had to start your heart 5 times. In hospital, you're propped up by drugs. It's quite unreal. So to recover that experience, Parker tells the story in a series of chapters, and each chapter is narrated by an object, by the tourniquet which was used to staunch the flow of blood from his severed limb, by the tube inserted into his throat at Camp Bastion, by the surgical saw which removed his leg, by a plasma bag, by a catheter, by a wheelchair, by his series of prosthetics. It's an extraordinarily effective way of telling that story, because what it reminds us is that in war, the body becomes an object space, not for the person that it contains and the person who exceeds that body, but for all of those involved in managing that body, it becomes an object. So too, even his first prosthetics. You improved on me, but you became thinner. The pressure I exerted on you, the weight you lost from the energy I used, made your stump shrink. I could no longer support you properly. And what you have there is this intimate relationship between the material world of objects and the fleshy world of the soldier's body. Of course, it's precisely that engagement which, in a sense, injures the body of Harry Parker, but it's also those intimate engagements which ultimately will also save the body of Harry Parker. But I started out by talking about those civilians on the Western Front. And I said most of the casualties were soldiers. But we need to understand that one of the characteristics of late modern war is that it, more than any previous war perhaps, is war amongst the people. And that many of those who are injured and killed during the war are civilians. In Afghanistan between 2001 and 2016, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 American and Allied troops have been killed. That compares against a minimum estimate of 33,000 Afghan civilians. 23,000 American and Allied troops have been wounded, compared with over 40,000 Afghan civilians. In other words, 10 times as many Afghan civilians were killed and twice as many were wounded. And that difference is in part because those Afghan civilians have a much more restricted access to medical care. The numbers of soldiers killed in modern wars has gone down and down and down. But that's because the number of wounded has gone up and up and up. Because now medical science and those extraordinary casualty evacuation chains means that many more survive. But when you look at Afghan civilians who are denied access to that priority medical care, to that high-speed medical evacuation, the difference is extraordinary. And so we know that the military medical machine in Afghanistan does treat civilians. It does evacuate them from conflict zones. But we also know that owing to its own rules of eligibility, the rules of the game say that as soon as possible, Afghans must be cared for by Afghans. And that means that they're immediately removed from this high-tech world of late modern medicine towards a radically different world. And it's in an attempt to fill some of the gaps in the Afghan medical system that other humanitarian agencies, very different from those that operated on the Western Front, organisations like MSF, have tried to plug the gap with their trauma centre. So, for example, we here need to confront the ways in which hospitals, particularly those which claim to treat all sides in a war, have become targets for military violence. They're no longer safe havens. And you think of the MSF Trauma Centre in Kunduz, which was bombed in October 2015. Shot at repeatedly for over 30 to 40 minutes by an AC-130 gunship. Now, I'm quite sure that for the American Special Forces on the ground and for those in the gunship, this was the product of a concatenation of mistakes and errors. It wasn't, from their part, deliberate, but they were relying on intelligence supplied to them by Afghan Special Forces. And I've got no doubt that the information that they fed to the Americans was deliberate. They couldn't stomach the fact that MSF was there treating not only civilians, but the Taliban. But for those who survive the trauma centre, those who are treated successfully by those humanitarian agencies, what future waits for them? And here we need to compare the extraordinary prosthetics made available to people like Harry Parker. And I don't mean to diminish the horror and the trauma that they've suffered, but compare those prosthetics, the arms and the legs that are available to those men and women with what's available to Afghanistan today. And you can see the ghosts of the First World War and the prostheses which were offered to soldiers then, which they saw as a rosy prospect, according to Kate Luard. You can see those ghosts stalk the world today. So when we think of bodies at war today, we need to honour the bodies of the soldiers, because soldiers, after all, are not just vectors of violence, they're also the victims of it. And I have no time for that lazy politics which says that the left cares about their civilians and the right cares about our soldiers. As Anne insisted, the bodies of the soldier and the civilian are intimately entwined, but we should never forget the bodies of the civilians too. Thank you.
My name is George Beliveau, and I developed and directed the play you're about to see, Contact Unload. This is a collaboration between theater, counseling psychology, and military veterans. we're sharing what it means to transition home after service. The 5 veterans that you're about to meet tonight, they're all graduates of the Veterans Transition Network, which is a group-based therapeutic program. So why theater? Perhaps we should ask first, what is theater? A definition I like to use is that theater is a place to see, a place to witness, a place where people gather to see, hear, witness humanity unfold. The British playwright Edward Bond suggests, as beings we conceived of a house because we needed somewhere to live. We conceived of a theater because we needed somewhere to feel, to question, to safely witness the consequences of human impulses, to share with one another the sense of what it is to be human. The stage affords us the conditions to humanize individuals as audiences weep and laugh in a shared space in communion with one another. And what we're about to share over the next 30 minutes, this performance, this exchange of breath between performers and audience can never be fully replicated or captured. It's ephemeral, what's going to happen tonight. So only the essence of our collective experience will remain. So we have performed this play, Contact Unload, 12 times to date, with various versions from a 50-minute script to a 17-minute script, with different veterans performing. So there's over 1,000 people who have witnessed this play to date, including Prince Harry. And the mural as well behind us by Foster Eastman has also been witnessed by well over 1,000 people. So we hope that they have come, these people have seen it, with a new understanding on what it truly means for veterans to transition home after serving their country. So this is just a quick forewarning that if some audience members are activated, their emotions or physical reactions of watching the play, we do have professional counselors here that you can meet them at the door after the performance. I'm also forewarning you that there is coarse language in the play. So on behalf of my co-leads on this project, Marv Westwood, who's to my left, and Foster Eastman, and the generous support of Movember Canada and UBC and the Peter Wall Institute, we present Contact Unload.
On the horizon there's plenty of storm clouds brewing, and the smell in the air is a smell of mistrust and fear. And they're gathering the young men and women to use them as fodder for the men who think up these wars will never come here. In the cities and farms, the mothers are openly weeping for the lives of their children the government sends off to war. But their children know better, 'cause they have their band of brothers. And war doesn't matter to them, they fight for more. Oh, down by the river, there's just the sound of the water. And over the hill is the thunder and crashing of war. And the souls of the fallen are leaving and rising to heaven. Ah, they will need to be fighting their brethren no more. If you hear this song, well, it might make you wonder how I could extol the virtues of a man with a gun. Duty will make a man stand in the face of great peril. When he thinks of those that he loves and he just wants to run. So here's to the man who knows when to lay down his weapon. And here's to the man who knows when it's time to fight. Oh, here's to the man who'll stay behind with his brother. Ah, here's to the man who knows the best way to die. Oh, now here's to the man who'll stay behind with his brother. Ah, here's to the man who knows the best way to die.
Do we engage? They asked. Do we engage? I ordered that guy on the roof with the RPG. He was the informant. I killed him. This is exactly what I deserve.
We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispin, and he that shall live this day and see old age will yearly to the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's Day! Then will he strip his sleeves, show his scars, and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's Day. What's that? He wishes so, my cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin, if we are marked to die, then we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor, God's will I pray thee wish not one man more!
Tim. Hey. What you doing, man? Nothing.
Pretty quiet around here, eh?
Yeah.
Hey, maybe we should do something together.
Sure, Chuck, but maybe some.
We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispin. And he that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named and rouse him in the name of Crispin. And he that shall live this day and see old age will yearly to the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's Day.
Philip, it's not working. I mean, it's sounding too much like Brahma. It's too bombastic. There's too much acting.
Yeah, but it's Shakespeare. It needs to be big. It has that momentum.
But I want a different Henry V. I want to move away from the Olivier Grandeur. I want you to make it more human. Because St. Crispin was the saint of cobblers and tanners and curriers, working men, not soldiers. So I want you to convince them, not with music and pomp and thunder, but with truth and honesty.
Yeah, but I've seen every version of this play.
And to help you get there, I've invited some guests. Remember those gentlemen we met after rehearsal last week?
They wanted in here when you made us run late.
The same. Philip, come on in, gentlemen. I want you to meet some military veterans. I want you to meet Tim, Chuck, Stephen, and Luke. These are veterans who've returned from deployment, and they work here in this space with the Veterans Transition Network. They work on enactments to help them transition back to civilian life.
We come here to drop our baggage.
Yeah, to unload.
We use enactments to recreate scenes and moments from the past.
To say goodbye or sorry to a buddy, for example.
And the good news is that they have agreed to help you work on your speech because they know all too well what it's like to come back. So I want you to play off of them.
So try and convince them to go back into battle?
Exactly. And I've asked them to stop you at any time a memory is triggered or stirred, and to share their thoughts with you, to help you understand what you're asking your men to do. You got it? Capiche? All right. From the top.
What's that he wishes so, my cousin Westmoreland? No, my fair cousin, if we are marked to die, then we are not.
Come on! It's fucking awesome! It's fucking awesome to be marked to die! I mean, you've got to die when you join. You can't have the fear of dying over there. I mean, it was fucking awesome! I know I keep fucking saying that, but it was fucking awesome. But there's nothing like that here. I miss it. Christ, I miss it.
There'd be days of boredom, weeks of boredom.
Looking out at a desert that never changes.
I've looked at that same fucking rock for days.
You wait for those seconds, those minutes, those moments.
That's what you wait for.
Not your family. Over here they can't exist.
If they exist, you die.
So, you wait to get shot. Wait to see if you're gonna...
Gauge! All right, boys, bring on, take an aid. Check yourselves out.
How many mags you got?
Later.
3. You?
Same.
Fuck. Did you even see what we were shooting at?
Not a clue, man.
All I saw was dust.
That's all your mother sees is dust too, motherfucker.
Fuck you.
Silence.
Birds aren't chirping anymore.
It's the silence.
Before it all begins,
That's what's fucking scary.
we've got a lot of time to think in the silence.
I wanted to be useful. By 2008, it was all roadside bombs and suicide bombers. I was standing on the front gate of Kandahar Airfield. This kid, dressed all in black, came right past our big red stop sign and big red stop light. He was coming right at us. I remember my sergeant, he's screaming and yelling, thinking I'm supposed to fire a warning shot first. But he's getting closer. 60 feet, 55 feet, 50 feet. There's no longer any barriers between us. He's just a kid. I start to squeeze the trigger, hesitate for a split second. He turns his bicycle. That was it. I can't stop thinking like, shit. Maybe that was my one chance to fire my rifle this whole tour. Thank God I didn't, but it's hard to get over that feeling and wishing you'd done your piece.
Fuck.
Gauge! The adrenaline's going. There's no time to think. There's no time to be fucking terrified. I know it's fucking awesome, but... Christ, I miss it. Tim, you're not looking so good.
Nah, man, I'm fine.
Listen, man, I've seen shit too. I want you to come to this group I've been going through. It's been kind of help me out.
Listen, Chuck. I'm fucked up, but I'm not fucked up like you.
Like, listen, man, fucking injury's injury, buddy.
Look, there's tons of guys who need this more than me. I don't need this shit right now.
Maybe you're just not ready. Yeah.
So, Philip, you think you might be able to work some of them, that excitement, that rush again, knowing that some of the guys might want to serve again?
It's hard to imagine going back to that, but I'll give it a shot. Where from?
Let's take it from, then shall he roll his cuff?
Strip his sleeve?
Right, strip his sleeve.
Then shall he strip his sleeve, show his scars, and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day, old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, be in their flowing cups, freshly remembered.
No. Not freshly remembered. Not like this. Not with feats. Not with celebration. It's supposed to be me that day. I was supposed to be in the vehicle and switch places at the last second. Bang! Get to the vehicle, try to save his ass. There's blood everywhere, it's sweating. You get quick clawed out, try to stop bleeding. Fuck, it burns your hands. Fuck, it should have been me.
Helicopter flying around with some goddamn general inside.
Hope you like this fucking flight.
Should be my friend on that helicopter.
Should have been me.
Put his head down.
My hand right there.
Should have been me.
I could feel his breath.
In, out.
Got you, man.
Getting shallow.
In, out.
Tried to tell him.
In,
Should have been me.
Out.
I wish it was me.
Tried to tell him.
in, and out.
Chopper finally comes.
Put him on a stretcher. Load him in.
The fucking stretcher wouldn't fit. The doors wouldn't close. We had to dump him out inside. Fucking blood everywhere. It's horrible.
The last thing he saw were the soles of his boots.
They asked me to be his escort officer.
Shoved him in the back of a C-130 for 16 hours with a casket.
Should have been me.
He wanted his uniform hung. He didn't want it shoved in the overhead compartment. His friend was only going to wear it one last time.
Son, do you know where you are?
Canada, I think.
We watched him as they take his casket off the plane.
His 5-year-old son puts his hand on his dad's casket.
Should have been me.
No time to grieve.
A job to do.
We flew down the highway of heroes.
It was completely empty.
Firefighters in full uniform, lights all going.
And policemen saluting.
The people.
Everywhere.
Crying for someone they'd never known. Never even met.
No time to grieve.
Got a job to do. I have to support the family.
My son, he spoke of you often. It was his favorite. He wanted you to have him.
Grieving father's last wish. What was I gonna do with an old hockey jersey? A Maple Leafs one at that. Oh, Philip. That was something.
I'm starting to see what some of you might bring back with you.
Yeah. Often we don't even know ourselves.
No, we go through hell and we bring it back and we spread it around.
What do you mean?
Yeah, it's not just us that suffers.
It's everyone around us.
Friends, families, everyone.
All right.
Hey!
What's going on?
Paradise.
Bring it, bring him
Oh,
home. Money on the table.
Quick, Dad. Money back.
Exam cards.
All right.
Let's go here.
Let's do this. Deuce of spades, 4 of spades, 6 of spades on the table.
20.
Call.
Yeah.
All right, a little conservative.
Another card.
7 of spades.
40.
Call.
Yeah, fold.
We.
Oh. All right. King of spades.
Oh, nice.
Jesus, last time we saw a suited flop is it's when your boy cleaned
It's
house.
the last time you ever cleaned anything.
Yeah, I do straight flush the cheat.
You know, I was proud. My boy, being a soldier like me, really proud. I never told him that. I always expected my boy to come home. It just wasn't the same.
It's hard.
You know, last time I spoke with him, I could tell something was wrong. I told him to go for a run. My son, he's reaching out to me, and all I can do is tell him to go for a goddamn run. It's just after that he...
No.
Fucking sick of
It's
this.
his wounds from Afghanistan.
I'm sick of this talk. He didn't fucking die in Afghanistan. He blew his brains out in this fucking kitchen.
Thought it was a car backfire.
Dad, he killed himself.
No.
Hey, his wounds killed him.
Exactly. His wounds from combat zone killed him.
It's worse. It's worse than dying from a bomb or a bullet. It's crueler.
It's more vicious. Gets inside of you and it gets inside of all of us.
I'm worried about your younger boy.
Can't seem to get over it.
He shouldn't have seen that.
You know, he's going camping with the boys this weekend. They'll help pull him through.
Tim. Hey, man, we haven't seen you around much, man.
Will you guys fuck off! Leave me alone. There's people all around me. It's not real. None of it's real. Going fucking shopping, $100 shoes, $1,000 purses. Who cares if your coffee's not 180 fucking degrees? Fuck! You don't have a clue! It's not real! Afghanistan was real. It was something. When I was there, I was something. When I'm here, I'm just fucking dead inside.
Philip, what do you think?
I'm starting to see that these men in front of me know I'm much more than just the raw, romantic part of war. And if I'm going to have to convince them to go back into battle, I'm going to have to try things a little differently.
So you think you might be able to work that into your monologue?
Let me try.
All right. Let's take it from Then Shall Our Faces.
Names. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, be in their flowing cups, freshly remembered. And Crispin shall ne'er go by from this day until the ending of the world. But we in it shall be remembered. We few, us happy few, us band of brothers.
Philip, that thing you say, band of brothers. You know, man, I carry them here. Justin, Derek, and Colin. I left them there, but every day I carry my band of brothers with me. You know, we didn't do this for you. We didn't do this for some fucking cause. We did this for these guys here. The men on my left and the men on my right. The guys who came back. And the guys who didn't. This is the reason why we fought. And it's probably the reason why we'll fight again. This is my band. And we're still bound.
Through these fields of destruction, baptisms of fire, I've witnessed your suffering as a battle raged high. And though they did hurt me so bad, in the fear and alarm, you did not desert me, my brothers in arms.
Tim, man.
Did I stutter? Leave me the fuck alone.
Okay, this is fucking enough, man. You've been living like this for 10 fucking years. You know, I've seen shit too. What is fucking wrong with you? Look, man, you're turning one casualty into two. Look, there's no hope at the end of a gun, and there's certainly not at the bottom of a bottle.
What fucking choice do
Well,
I have?
how's this fucking choice
Like
working?
shit!
Yeah, like fucking shit! Well, listen, why don't you come with me? There's something better.
Where?
Anywhere better than fucking here? Tim, for fuck's sake, man. The Army told us to rely on each other, didn't it? I've got your fucking back, do I not?
Yeah.
Okay then. Then come with me. Listen. This group, it works. It's probably going to be the fucking hardest thing that you've ever done. But man, it pretty well saved my life.
Save your life?
Yeah, it saved my life.
Okay.
Hey, youngster. Go, man.
All right, guys, thanks for introducing yourselves and welcoming Tim to the group. Tim, walk with me for a minute, and why don't you tell us a bit about your story?
Well, what can I say? I was lucky on my tour. Never shot at, not blown up. I mean, the only blood I shed was from a goddamn nosebleed, because the desert's so fucking dry.
Well, Tim, you know you don't have to be shot at to not be okay.
Tim, if you go, you've been hurt.
We all come back with wounds, man.
These guys, they know.
Well, it sounds fucking stupid. It happened in a fucking office chair. I had my radio headset on. It's like this cage, this trap you can't fucking take off. That's where I was sitting on August 3rd, 2006. In that fucking office chair.
Stephen, would you sit in that chair? You're going to stand in for Tim here. You're going to be his double. So, Tim, tell us what happened.
Well, an IED blew up a convoy. 4 killed, 10 wounded. It was all the wounded.
Now, Tim, just take your time while you're telling us the story, because this is real, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
After the explosion,
That's right, just go slow.
After the explosion, they started receiving effective enemy fire from a nearby compound. But there was nothing I could do. You see, it's protocol. The medevac birds won't fly in if there's effective enemy fire on the ground. These men were dying, painfully, and there was nothing I could do. I had to tell them no one was coming. But they just kept fucking asking.
Just take a deep breath. And out. One more. When you're ready.
The 2 Apaches came on station. We had an informant on the ground. He was giving us the location of the firefight. A compound, red roof with green gate. A secondary target appeared on the roof. He had a fucking RPG. The pilots they called, they wanted to know if they should engage. Do we engage, they asked. What was I supposed to do? Of course, neutralize the target. They fucking cut him in half. I ordered that guy killed. But he was a fucking informant. He was trying to save the lives of our people on the ground. He's trying to save their fucking lives. I killed him. This is exactly what I deserve.
Okay. Just pause. Thanks, guys. Now, Tim, if I understand you correctly, you didn't realize the guy on the roof with the RPG was the informant. Isn't that right?
Well, what fucking difference does it make? No, but He's still fucking dead. I still killed him.
Okay, well, we're going to do something here. Stephen, he's your double. Okay? So he's going to be you. Now look at Stephen. Look at yourself. Imagine he just told you that story. What would you say to him?
It's not your fault. I want you to feel better. But it is his fault. You killed him.
Okay, so it's his fault.
And there's nothing you can do about it.
Look at him. Do you want him to feel better?
I need him to feel better.
Okay. So, he has to suffer for this for the rest of his life. Or could you forgive him?
We forgive you, Tim.
Yeah.
I want to, but I don't know if I can.
Okay, but you've taken a first step here. You've told your story. They've seen you. You've looked at yourself. And they've forgiven you. Even if you can't forgive yourself yet.
I need that.
Okay.
If I could forgive him,
And forgive yourself.
if I could forgive myself, maybe I could start to live again.
Tim, you're on your way, brother. Okay? You've taken a big step here. What do you need to keep going?
More of this, more life. Like, I haven't been fucking alive for 10 fucking years.
10 years. It's a long time, man. All right. You know what? You've been working hard. Why don't you pull up a chair? Let's hear what the rest of the group has to say.
Tim, I never get tired of that light bulb moment. You know, when a guy realizes he doesn't have to live with that baggage. He drops it. That's why I come back as a para.
And my enacting saved me, man. Like, I felt like I was drowning. There was a weight around my ankles and I couldn't get air. It's not rosy now. It's not perfect, but it's a big step.
Yeah. You know, I carried a lot of anger around inside, man. And then all of a sudden I'd be fucking hijacked by it, but those fucking VTN guys, they fucking one of them right there. Those fucking guys. They dragged me through shit and got me to unload.
You know, here with you guys, I don't feel alone anymore, you fucking pricks. You know, I didn't believe you, but I'm really starting to see how much strength it takes to unfuck your shit.
So, Tim, you've done a lot of work. You've dropped some baggage. Feel any lighter?
Yeah, like I just dropped a deuce.
All right, guys, let's call it a day there.
Well,
that fucking sucked.
It fucking certainly does, doesn't
Fucking
it?
shit. That was the hardest fucking thing I've ever to do. Those
No,
pricks
but-
made me go back.
Tim, was it worth it?
Fuck yeah.
Thanks, brother.
This day is called the Feast of Crispin.
And he that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named.
And rouse him at the name of Crispin.
He that shall live this day and see old age
Will yearly on his vigil feast his neighbors.
And say tomorrow is St. Crispin's Day.
Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say,
These wounds I had on Crispin's Day.
Times in our life, we all have pain, we all have sorrow. But if we are wise, we know that there is always tomorrow. We know we're all not strong. the road, and I'll share your load. And if you just call me, lean on me when you're not strong, and I'll be your friend. I'll help you carry on. Oh, it won't be long till I'm gonna need somebody to lean on. You just call me. You just call me. Yeah, you just call me. Oh, you just call me.
So everyone else has identified themselves. Maybe would you guys mind stating your names and your backgrounds?
Yeah, I'm Dale Hamilton. I was in the first iteration of this play here, so it was actually quite strange to not be in it and just watching it. So that was interesting. I'm a Afghan vet as well and a graduate of VTN.
And I'm Tim Laidler. I was obviously in the play, also Afghan veteran, served in 2008, and helped get some of the funding through Movember for this production, and I ended up joining it in this last version and going to be acting in it in Ottawa next week as well.
So I want to direct the first question to both of you. As I watched this evening unfold, it struck me that perhaps a better title for all of these presentations, sort of a collective title, might have been Casualty of War Stories. War stories themselves, that term, can sometimes have a negative connotation. People tell war stories because they've lived these experiences and it's so visceral to them. And there's often such a disconnect between your lived experience and telling that war story and the person who's listening to that war story who is so clueless about what you're really talking about. So I want to find out from both of you why you feel it's important to tell the stories of war.
Right, well, what I actually found in my own process of dealing with what I was going through is that the thing I was doing, and it was actually the worst thing, was being silent about it, not talking to anyone about it, be it my family, friends, my spouse. I just, I think it was the second category of PTSD, the avoidance, that was how I handled things. And it was only through going through the VTN that got me started in actually talking to other vets, and then from there talking to members of the community in projects like these, that I found, even though you're having to give your story to somebody who doesn't understand it, doesn't necessarily grasp what you're talking about, it helps me more than it helps anyone else in that normalizing of my experience and my trauma.
For this one, I think a lot of the older generation of veteran, a lot of people have friends or family members who served in World War II or Korea, and they have that image of them never talking about the war and sort of bottling it up. And I think part of that's because it can be very triggering to talk about the stories, but also, as we sort of said, that there's just no frame of reference for when they came back. For myself, when I went in 2008, I was at my third year at UBC, living in a frat house, and our regiment got the call and ended up in Afghanistan and came back to finish my fourth year. And coming back into fourth year at UBC with the students, they've got the glamorized version from Hollywood movies, and it's that it is that rah rah rah, and they're asking me, so were you shooting machine guns? Like how, was it cool or what? And it's just sort of that young machoism, and there was pieces of that, but for the 2,500 soldiers that are on my tour, most of them are not engaging in combat, at any sort of regular basis. And you have to think it's less like any other big institution. There's going to be a sniper at the front lines who's taking the shots. There's going to be people engaged in that, but there's a huge support network behind it. And it's so hard for people who are not engaged in that traditional actual combat to talk about their experiences and not have people think, oh, well, you weren't really overseas. You weren't really in danger. So it's sort of somehow people invalidate their own stories, and getting out here and trying to show that it's more nuanced and not what we always see on TV is, I think, important to help people understand that, it's still service, and we all do our part, but it's like little cogs in a big machine.
Ann Jones, a similar question to you. I mean, you've spent a lot of your career going to war zones. You have been often one of the rare journalists who's actually gone outside the wire and put yourself in true harm's way in war zones. Why has it been important for you to risk your life, literally, to tell stories about war?
Well, I wanted to know what it was like, because I grew up in a violent household with a war veteran. My father was a veteran of World War I, highly decorated and highly damaged, more mentally than physically. And he came home, became a successful small businessman, highly respected in the community, very active civically. He came home looking like one of those veterans we hear about who just came home and was a big success. But what went on behind closed doors in the household was something else again, and my father had nightmares till the end of his life. He died at age 80, still waking up screaming about the First World War. So I've been involved with thinking about war from a number of different perspectives all my life. And then after 9/11, I kind of went to war myself.
Derek, a similar question to you. You're a respected academic. You've spent a lot of your career looking at various aspects of politics. What is it about war that draws you, especially at this stage of your life where you've really embraced telling visceral stories about war as you did tonight?
My own training is a geographer, and geography is a discipline which, perhaps more than most, has been intimately involved in the planning and prosecution of war for at least 100 years. And looking back over the course of human history, I can find so few good wars that it seemed to me important to try and not simply undo the damage, because you can't undo the damage that's been passed, but to try to understand better the ways in which war has and has not changed. And what I realized when I started to look at the First World War was that there were pages and pages of plans and schematic diagrams. So before the troops went over the top, the order of battle would be typed out, 24 foolscap pages. At 0700 this would happen, at 0705 that would happen, at 0710 this would happen. But of course it would only happen at 0710 if what was supposed to happen at 0705 had happened. And it very rarely had, because it's one thing to plan a battle on a map, but it's quite another to struggle across a mud-soaked morass under machine gun fire. The same kind of thing was true in Vietnam, where again, colonels were notorious for hovering over the field of battle in their helicopters, sending instructions down to the grunts on the ground, without any regard for the sheer physicality of the world that they were inhabiting. But in both those cases, I went into the archives thinking that I knew how god-awful the First World War was, and how god-awful Vietnam was. But I had no idea. And when you sit, for example, in the Imperial War Museum in its record room, and you turn over the pages of diaries and letters, there's something intensely visceral. I don't pretend that that's any substitute for being there. But if you have any imagination, any sense of fellow feeling, you can begin to glimpse, I recognise as an academic from the outside, some of the horror that's been contained and erased. And it seems to me that part of our responsibility as academics and as intellectuals more generally is to listen to those who have first-hand knowledge of that experience, but also to try to share through those conversations with others a real sense of the horror of war, particularly because in the 21st century we assume that the horrors of war are always visited on other people. Increasingly, of course, those other people are located in the Arab or the Islamic world. And we take the violence that's wrought upon them for granted. So a bomb goes off in Baghdad and people shrug their shoulders. What do you expect? It's Baghdad. There's an explosion in Beirut. Dozens of people killed. What do you expect? That's what those people are like. Well, let me tell you, that is not what those people are like, and they don't deserve to live in those war zones any more than the people of Paris or London do.
You set me up for my question for Farah. But before I ask that, I'd like to welcome audience members to just come up to the microphones if you have a question you'd like to ask the panel, and maybe you could start making your way now as I ask this question. So Farah Nash, you've spent a lot of your career covering wars, particularly in the Middle East. This is a loaded question, maybe a tough question, but does it matter? Does it make a difference? I can virtually guarantee there will be another war in the Middle East and other parts of the world. The work that Anne has done, the work that you have done, the work I've done, that so many journalists have done, often risking our lives, putting our families to worry, telling our stories, does it matter?
I think that my answer to that is different based on my mood of the week. And returning after a few years of doing the work at that time, sort of fresh out of it, I probably would have said that it didn't. I definitely went into it with an element. I was 28 and I had really was paying attention to the impact of the photography that came out of Vietnam and how that photography actually made a difference in shaping public opinion and the direction of the war. Well, that wouldn't really happen again. And, I remember being in Baghdad, March 2003, and speaking to my family here and hearing about the numbers and the protests, and surely this war wasn't actually going to happen, and the mobilization on the streets of London, and you remember all of that. And the war happened. And while the war was happening, it was like, well, the New York Times is here, and when everyone sees this and they hear about this bombing, or when, when Gaza's on the front page of the New York Times, surely that's going to stop. And then it doesn't, and it doesn't, and it doesn't. So I think it's easy to come back and say it doesn't matter, at a given time. And the price is high, right? You risk your life. You, as a freelancer, you spend all your money to get there and be there, and you don't know if you're going to be published. And but I think I've been convinced that without it, we're done, right? We absolutely don't have a choice, and on some level, we just have to support those who are willing to take those risks and go on whatever level, because not many people are willing to do it, right? So it's just a matter of supporting those who are willing and giving them a voice. I mean, without it, what would we know, right? And like I said earlier, we have these waves of feeling exhausted or we can't handle, but the sources of feeding us the information to know what's truly happening in the ground is available. And in terms of having that conversation, I'm a mother of 2 boys now, and I feel like those are the conversations that we also need to start having with our kids. the iPad thing, I just can't believe it. Going into a restaurant and seeing kids on iPads, I have such a big thing with that when we need to be having conversations with them and really reclaiming conversations. And how many of you can sort of admit that the introduction to war for your children was a video game? You know, or if you have teenagers, Game of Thrones. Right? So that conversation, if they're learning about war through those outlets, we have to be having conversations about what war really is, what war, you know, and sharing news stories. You know, 10 years old is not too young. My nephew's asking so many questions about war and what it's actually like, and there's a way to have that conversation.
Could I add something?
Please.
Could I just add for anyone in the audience who may not know that a lot of modern weaponry now, particularly that manufactured in the US, is made specifically in the same way as the controlling, whatever you call those controlling gizmos, in all of these war games. So that when very young men go to war, they already know how to operate everything. They already have the hand dexterity. That's what your kids are being trained for.
Question there?
I'd like to say I'm glad this is going to Ottawa. I think that's a great place to show this play. I'd like to ask the two veterans, specifically around the troubles in the Middle East right now. If you could keep this to a one-word answer, because I think it'd be very telling, a one-word answer. Should we intervene?
Yes.
I can't actually do a one-word answer. I'm probably the last person who should answer that question. Because again, it changes based on my mood and based on, I'll have a different answer at the end of the show and I have at the moment.
The real answer, I think, is that Britain and France and Canada and the United States have been intervening for years in the region. And I don't mean that's the only reason for the misery that's being inflicted upon so many of its inhabitants, but it's surely part of the answer. Intervention doesn't just begin when the airplanes fly, when the blue helmets move in, when the supply convoys move in. It begins long before that, with political meddling, with working to overthrow democratically elected leaders, with doing everything you can to squash the Arab Spring, for example. That's intervention too. And no, we shouldn't on those terms.
My question's of a totally different nature. I mean, it's for the veterans and any other veterans that I don't get why you guys don't have chairs. But you're welcome to answer too. The part that I will go away thinking about tonight, as I lie in bed, was Tim's moment. What got Tim out of that chair? And what got all of you out of the chair when someone was saying, you need to fucking deal with your shit? What makes any human deal with their shit? That's what's so interesting to me. You and you and you and you, right? Because you acted out dealing with your shit, but a lot of us in here need to deal with our shit on a different level, right? But I'm just saying, what is happening in that moment, or is it in layers? One of you, and I can't remember your name, said, I love that moment when we see that, we see the layers chip away, or whatever the metaphor was that you used. So I'm just interested in anybody who wants to speak to that moment when you're willing to get out of the chair.
My own experiences weren't. I won't quote the play. It's I'm not as fucked up as you are. But they weren't quite as intense as some of the other guys. My own experiences helping someone through, seeing someone spark that wasn't there, that was extinguished at one point, and you see them come out of the depths, and that it's powerful. It's powerful to see to see your brothers in arms help someone up jointly and then see them come back into the light. So for me, I mean, I'm pursuing a master's in counseling psychology because of it, to see that, to be part of that, to experience that. So, yeah, seeing a guy drop his baggage, I guess. I don't know if that's it's a long-winded, roundabout answer. I don't know if I answered anything, but yeah. So.
Yeah, I can add on, like for a bit of the research that we do see is that hypermasculine people tend not to go into counseling until they're in a moment of crisis, and that's why we do frame ourselves as a program. The Veterans Transition Network is a charity that operates the program, so we'll say, hey, we're taking this UBC course or this UBC program, it's 10 days long, and I'll say, what is that? Is for people who are all fucked up? And like, no, it's transition, help you be successful, talk about a bunch of different things, and that gets them in the front door. Then they meet the counselor, who we say, it's the facilitator, and then they start to slowly bring in all the informed consent about what's going to go on. But that's how we've been recruiting from day one, and it's been successful.
And let me ask you, because you shared this sort of intimate detail about your father and having been a World War I veteran and clearly suffering from what then was called shell shock, and having reported on PTSD among soldiers, have you seen an improvement in terms of both the hypermasculinity that was just described, awareness and consciousness by the military to address these issues? Are things improving from your perspective as a journalist in terms of the plight of soldiers and the support they get?
Well, I wasn't actually present at World War I myself. But I do know there was no help for my father except what he was able to gain for himself through Alcoholics Anonymous, and that enabled him to become sober and to help others, and he always helped veterans of subsequent wars himself because there weren't all that many services for veterans. I can only speak about the United States, I think, where there are greatly improved services for veterans, though, as I indicated in talking about the history of PTSD, I think its original purpose has been so distorted that it's now used to gloss over the things that happen to soldiers instead of really help them to come through it. And having been a civilian myself in war zones with combat soldiers, I think I can say to civilians in the audience that you have no idea what happens in war. You have no idea. And all the movies and even this drama that we saw tonight and the testimony of veterans, it's not something a civilian can understand. And most of the people who do treatment of veterans are civilians. And they do their best, everybody does their best, but to me, there isn't any cure for war except peace. And we never get peace these days. So my feeling is firmly just nobody should ever have to go to war for anything. It is not worth it.
Thank you very much. I am from Afghanistan. I was born and raised there. I'm standing here to express my gratitude and my appreciation for the Canadian military. Thank you very, very much. Speaking of intervention, I believe that it's our duty as human beings to help others. In fact, that there are many people are alive today in Afghanistan and they're breathing. And there are many girls who received education in Afghanistan, including myself, that I was able to come to Canada, go to UBC and graduate. It is the result of intervention. There are a large number of Afghans in Afghanistan, actually a huge number of Afghans there, that they loved and they still love the Canadian military and the Canadian soldiers there. I remember seeing Canadians there going by on their military tank. They waved at people. They were very nice to girls there. I waved at them back. Thank you so much for going there, risking your life so you could save lives of Afghans. A couple of weeks ago, one of my coworkers in Vancouver was talking about his childhood and how fun it is to be a child, and he was mentioning about the highlights of his childhood. When he asked me, I paused for a minute, and my response was, all I remember from my childhood in Afghanistan is war, the sounds of military jets and the sounds of bullets. The fireworks in Vancouver still scare me. Thank you so much again for going to Afghanistan and saving many, many lives there in Afghanistan. Thank you.
I'm so grateful that we have a civilian in the house to share that with us. Thank you. I just feel like it's important to bring to light that every war is different as well, right? And there isn't a clear recipe for how it's going to turn out. And I think that if you were to ask Iraqi civilians right now who have lived through this last decade, has it been worth it? Was intervention the right thing? And I don't know if there's any Iraqi civilians who've lived through this recent war. I think it would be quite unlikely to have them say yes, right? I don't think that the Iraq war has benefited intervention. They're still living with ongoing daily tragedies of war. And it would, it's so crazy to think of, to have these backflashes. Sitting in Baghdad with the just imminent invasion in 2003. And their nephew, my cousin, said to me, remember this, because there's going to be a time when we long for Saddam's return. And I know that's a very controversial statement, but what he's saying is the war was never for the benefit of the Iraqi people. And as long as that was the case, the Iraqi people were never going to benefit. And they never did, and they never have. And, in recent weeks, we still have family who are calling us from Baghdad saying, get us to Canada. Get us out of here. We thought it would be better by now. We thought it would be okay. That's why we stuck it out. That's why we didn't accept your invitation to come to Canada, because we thought if we ride it out, it'll be fine, but it's not. So I totally appreciate your perspective on intervention, but I think it's important to know that there isn't a recipe for how it's going to turn out. And the consequences are different in every war.
We have time for just one more question.
I'm really curious because in a number of ways, different people said that essentially the war, or being over in Afghanistan, almost feels more real than life here. So I'm just really curious if somebody could elaborate on that.
Well, the bit of Tim's speech actually about the Starbucks, actually, I always like that bit. Personally, I went from Afghanistan, where I had a meaningful role in a cause that I believed in, and that I felt had an effect on the world, on the civilian population in Afghanistan. When I came home, I went back, I started EE University at 26, surrounded by a bunch of 18-year-old Vancouver kids. I don't know. It seemed a little bit different. It seemed a little bit... and they actually warned us, actually, coming back. They say people are going to seem shallow or trivial, you have to adjust to that. And after a while, you start longing to have a more meaningful experience again. And this doesn't seem as important as it feels a bit shallow. I mean, we are insulated in North America largely from these worse issues.
And I can give some sort of thoughts on that. Definitely when your life's at risk and everything's going, like all of your senses are hardwired, they're going at full tilt, so it does feel like you're more alive in those moments than when you're back here and you know it's safe and you're relaxed and you're sitting at home watching TV. So that's, I think, a piece of it. I think just to touch back on some of the, sort of a bit of philosophizing about war here, we always end up talking about it whenever we do these sort of things, and it's fine. I think, the hard thing about it is I didn't want to care about Afghans when I went over. Like, I grew up here. I thought, I saw Iraq. I didn't like Bush, and I was like, oh, we shouldn't be there. Like, why are we going in? I didn't know anything. And then I got there, and I met the Afghan National Army that I was in charge of mentoring. And I had 50 guys who were my age. I was 22. And I started talking to them through a translator, and slowly I started to learn their language. And you realize, they're just like us. Except the reality of their family, usually larger family, is that starvation, and there was a drought in Afghanistan for a long time too, is starvation's a real thing. And they're going to make life and death decisions about who in their family is going to survive that year. So, you start putting people with that mentality and growing up like that into a position where they're now a governor of a province and they have access to funds. Like, the morally right thing to do may be to steal that money and feed your family so your kids don't die. And it becomes very hard for us to judge them and say, oh, you're being corrupt and you're being wrong and you shouldn't do that. And you kind of see, I was like, well, if it's my kids, I might do that. And you see that, I've got so many stories and examples of time and time again, seeing Afghans overcoming that and showing up for work every day, getting paid $10 a month to be in the Afghan National Police, a bit more for the army. But they were proud of their country. And they're Tajik, Pashto fighting side by side to not have to live under a dictatorship anymore, to not be in a totalitarian state that oppresses women. And they were so excited to be, they were saying to me, we're so excited because one day, we're going to be a strong country like Canada. And if you ever need our help, we're going to be there to support you. So that's why I say, yes, some interventions are definitely good.
All I could add to that is an historical note, really. One of the images that haunts me from the First World War is an image of about a dozen young soldiers buried in a trench. They were all members of a PALS regiment. They were all recruited not just from the same town, but from the same district in the town. And when they were buried with their arms linked. And it speaks to the end of the play, it seems to me, because what you find in the letters of those survived again and again and again is they would go back to Britain, for example, on leave, and they were not at home there any longer because they encountered civilians who did not understand what war was like. They read reports in the press which were frankly contemptible. And they longed to be back in the war, not necessarily because they believed in the cause, because as it dragged on, increasingly the cause disappeared from view, but because they wanted to be back with their mates. And what I take from that is that one of the huge paradoxes of war is in the midst of such extraordinary humanity, so many men and women can actually find a common humanity, and what they value, what they care most about is an intensity of personal relationship, which back in the supposedly real, safe world is characterized by superficiality and ephemerality.
Thank you. Thank you for all of those. Thank you for all of those truly excellent questions on behalf of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, which organized and funded this evening. I want to thank them and thank all of you and the presenters and the veterans, the folks who are supporting the Veterans Transition Network, Playwright. It's a remarkable group of people here who have been sharing stories with you. I hope that we collectively have touched on at least some of the reality of war. For those of you who have had personal experience with war, I hope it resonated, and those of you who haven't, thank goodness you haven't, and maybe some of these stories made some sense. Now I want to invite all of you to join us for a reception, a half-hour reception in the outside, and thank you all.